I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The 11:15 p.m. from Paddington was not an assignment for the faint of heart. It was a train of tired bones, slightly frayed tempers, and people desperately wishing to be somewhere else, namely, in their beds. It rattled through the damp darkness of the Thames Valley, a rolling observatory for anyone with the inclination to watch human nature in its least guarded moments. Jane Marple, sitting primly in a corner of a first-class carriage, had every inclination. She had been visiting her niece in London, a delightful girl. Though Miss Marple secretly found her modern art utterly incomprehensible and was returning home to St. Mary Mead, she was, as always, the picture of a sweet, unassuming old lady. Her knitting needles clicked a rhythmic, soft accompaniment to the train's clack-clack, clack-clack. A half-finished pink baby booty grew slowly under her hands. Miss Marple looked as though she might be thinking about tea cakes or the proper pruning of roses. In reality, her mind was a steel trap of observation, filing away details that the average person would discard as trivial. She was observing her fellow passengers. There were 6 people in the compartment, including herself. Directly opposite her sat Colonel Arthur Bantry, a familiar face from the village. His robust red face was slightly flushed, and his breathing was heavy. He had spent the evening at his club in London, a fact Miss Marple deduced from the faint scent of old brandy and good cigars that clung to his tweed coat. His moustache bristled as he stared aggressively at his newspaper, though his eyes weren't moving. Colonel Bantry was not reading, he was brooding. He had had another row with his son. Miss Marple suspected a young man with ideas the Colonel found intolerable. It was sad, she mused, how expectations so often poisoned relationships. To the Colonel's left was Letitia Price. She was young, perhaps 24, and radiating a restless, almost vibrating tension. She had hair the colour of polished mahogany and eyes that kept darting from the carriage window, where only darkness could be seen, to the watch on her wrist. She held a thick brown envelope tightly on her lap, her knuckles white. Letitia was a legal secretary, and she often travelled with confidential documents. Miss Marple thought she looked not so much responsible as frightened. Fear, she noted, often resembled urgency. In the corner seat, next to Letitia, sat the victim. Alistair Finch was a man who seemed designed to take up space. He was large both in height and breadth, with a booming voice, mouth thankfully silent as he appeared to be asleep, and a manner that many found aggressively charming. He had left St. Mary Mead 20 years ago under a cloud of somewhat vague financial irregularities and had recently returned, wealthy, loud, and determined to modernize the village. He wore a gold ring too large for his finger and a suit that was expensive but just a little too flashy for a quiet country gent. Miss Marple knew him as a boy. Alistair Finch had been the sort who pulled wings off flies not out of cruelty, precisely, but from a profound lack of empathy, a self-centered curiosity about his own power. It was a trait she had observed in many men who ended up doing very bad things. He was leaning against the window, his hat pulled low, seemingly dozing after what Miss Marple guessed had been a dinner full of loud boasting and excessive claret. A silver hip flask was visible in his coat pocket. Next to Alistair Finch was the Reverend Julian Harmon. He was a quiet man, his face perpetually creased with a worried, intellectual sort of kindliness. He was reading a book on early Gnostic heresies, but he wasn't engaged. Every few minutes, he would look at Letitia Price, then quickly look away, a flash of colour coming to his cheeks. Miss Marple sighed inwardly. He was quite obviously in love with the girl, and quite obviously convinced he was beneath her notice. It was the kind of pining that made men foolish. Finally, in the corner seat next to Miss Marple, sat Mr. Harold Crabtree. He was a small, neat man, perhaps in his late 50s, with thick-rimmed glasses and a mouth like a tight line. He was an accountant, and he possessed the precise, judgmental stillness of a man who dealt in absolute numbers. He had spent the entire journey reviewing a spreadsheet on a clipboard, his face an unreadable mask of concentration. Occasionally he would cast a glance toward Alistair Finch's look of cold, calculating distaste. Miss Marple knew from village gossip that Mr. Crabtree was handling the accounts for Finch's new development project, a venture that many suspected was built on shaky ground. The train rushed on, the silence of the carriage only broken by the Colonel's loud rustling of his paper and the clicking of Miss Marple's needles. It happened as the train began its slow deceleration approach to St. Mary Mead station. The compartment's lights flickered once, then twice, and then extinguished completely. Total darkness engulfed them. It lasted for perhaps 30 seconds. In that silence, several things happened at once. There was a sudden, sharp gasp. Letitia Price, Miss Marple thought. A dull thud, as if something heavy had been dropped. A strange, rustling sound like paper being manipulated. And then, just as the train's brakes shrieked, the lights sputtered back to life. Dash it all, Colonel Bantry bellowed, finally dropping his newspaper. What's the matter with the lighting on this line? Letitia Price was pressing herself back into her seat, looking terrified. The brown envelope she had been holding was now on the floor. She scrambled to pick it up, her hands shaking. It's all right, she stammered, tucking it into her bag. Dreadful service. Absolutely dreadful, Mr. Crabtree muttered, his face pinched with annoyance. He methodically reorganized the papers on his clipboard. Reverend Harmon looked from Letitia to the rest of them, his brow furrowed. Everyone is quite all right? Miss Marple looked at the victim. Alistair Finch hadn't moved. He was still in the corner, his hat pulled low over his eyes, leaning against the window. He hadn't joined in the grumbling. He hadn't made a boisterous joke about being left in the dark. He was perfectly still, too still. The train lurched to a halt at the small, dim platform of St. Mary Mead station. "Ah, home at last," Colonel Bantry said, standing up and reaching for his coat. The carriage door opened and a tired-looking guard appeared. "St. Mary Mead, all change for St. Mary Mead. This train terminates here." No one moved. "Come along now, sir," the guard said, stepping into the carriage and addressing Alistair Finch. "Can't stay here all night, can we?" The guard reached out and gave Finch's shoulder a gentle shake. Alistair Finch's body didn't wake. Instead, it slid slowly sideways, like a heavy sack, turning in the seat until his face was visible. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, his mouth slack. The aggressive charm, the arrogance, the loud boasting had all vanished. "Good heavens!" Colonel Bantry exclaimed, stepping forward. He's had a turn." The Reverend Harmon rose quickly, his face pale. Is he sick?" The guard bent down, looking closely at the man. His tired expression vanished, replaced by an expression of sharp, clinical distress. He didn't check his pulse. "He's not sick, sir," the guard said, his voice unusually quiet in the small space. He looked up at the passengers. I am afraid this gentleman is dead." A collective gasp rippled through the carriage. But Miss Marple didn't gasp. She put her knitting away with calm, precise movements, her blue eyes sharp and attentive. While the others looked at the body, she was looking at them. She noted Letitia Price's fingers clenching her bag. She noted the Reverend's stunned, horrified gaze. She noted Mr. Crabtree's analytical, non-emotional appraisal, and she noted Colonel Bantry looked angrier than sad. Alistair Finch was dead. But Miss Marple knew, as surely as she knew the recipe for her grandmother's quince jelly, that he hadn't died of natural causes. He had been murdered in that fleeting moment of darkness, surrounded by people who all, she suspected, had very good reasons to want him gone. The crisp, cloudless night air of St. Mary Mead offered a sharp contrast to the stuffy, stale atmosphere of the train carriage. Word of the tragedy spread with unnatural speed. Before the station master had finished winding the handle of the telephone to summon the local constabulary, a small, shivering cluster of passengers stood on the platform, their breath pluming in the chill. Miss Marple stood a little apart, her knitted shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. She did not look at the darkened window where the unfortunate Mr. Finch remained, but rather at the faces of the living. Constable Palk arrived first, pedalling furiously on his bicycle, his helmet slightly askew. He was young and prone to fluster, and the sight of Colonel Bantry pacing the wooden planks did nothing to soothe his nerves. "Now see here, Palk," the colonel barked, pointing a thick, trembling finger toward the train. "Finch is dead, right there in the seat. My heart gave out, I should think. The man drank like a fish and ate like a horse. Bound to happen." "Yes, sir," Palk stammered, fumbling for his notebook. "I must ask everyone to remain." "Nonsense," Mr. Crabtree interrupted, his thin lips pulled taut. He checked his pocket watch, the metal gleaming in the pale light. "I have sensitive accounts to process. The man had a seizure. It is a medical matter, not a criminal one. There is absolutely no reason to detain those of us with business to attend to." Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in Mr. Crabtree's hands as he adjusted his spectacles. For a man who dealt exclusively in cold numbers, he seemed remarkably desperate to escape the deceased. Letitia Price had retreated to the wooden bench beneath the timetable board. She sat with her knees pressed together, arms wrapped around the thick brown envelope like a shield. She was shivering violently. The local clergyman, Reverend Thomas, hovered near her, offering quiet words of comfort that she entirely ignored. Her eyes remained fixed on the gravel beneath her sensible shoes. "It was the dark," Letitia whispered suddenly, her voice barely carrying over the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple took a slow, deliberate step closer. "The dark, my dear," she prompted gently, her tone identical to the one she used when asking the butcher about his lamb. Letitia looked up, pale and strained. When the lights went out, I felt a drought, as though someone had moved very quickly past my knees, and then a sound. "What sort of sound?" the Reverend asked, leaning in. "A scratch," she said, her voice dropping, "like a mouse on the skirting board, or a pin scraping against metal." Colonel Bantry snorted loudly. "Hysteria, pure hysteria. The train jolted, the lights failed, the man had a heart attack. It's all perfectly straightforward." But Miss Marple knew it was not straightforward. She remembered the distinct rustle of paper during that brief blackout. She remembered the dull thud. And she knew Alistair Finch had a silver hip flask in his coat pocket, a silver flask that might produce a scratching sound if someone were attempting to unscrew the cap in a hurry in the pitch black. Inspector Slack arrived moments later in a motor car, slamming the door with an authority that made Constable Pauk jump. Slack was a man who preferred obvious answers and quick arrests. As he began barking orders and herding the passengers into the station master's office for formal statements, Miss Marple quietly retrieved a small, unnoticed object from the platform floor, just beneath the carriage step. It was a single, silver-plated button, the thread still clinging to its back, severed cleanly by a sharp blade. She slipped it into her reticule. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly deceitful, but physical objects rarely lied. The station master's office was stiflingly warm, smelling strongly of old coal dust and the sharp tang of Inspector Slack's cheap aftershave. The room was crowded with the passengers, all forced into an uncomfortable proximity that made their underlying tensions practically hum in the stagnant air. Inspector Slack, whose aggressive efficiency often masked a lack of imagination, sat behind the chipped wooden desk, his notebook open and a fountain pen poised. Miss Marple had quietly claimed a hard-backed chair in the corner near the sluggishly ticking clock. She had retrieved her knitting, the pink booty occupying her hands, rendering her entirely invisible to the inspector. He saw only a dithering elderly spinster, exactly the sort of background noise he was accustomed to ignoring. "We shall proceed swiftly," Inspector Slack announced, glaring at the assembled group. "The police surgeon is examining the deceased, but given Mr. Finch's girth and complexion, I suspect we are dealing with a sudden cardiac event. However, protocol demands I record your statements. Colonel Bantry, we shall begin with you." The colonel puffed out his chest, his tweed suit looking rumpled under the harsh glare of the single overhead bulb. "As I told the constable, Slack, the man simply expired. I was reading my paper. The lights failed for perhaps 30 seconds. When they returned, Finch was as you found him. The man lived excessively. It caught up with him. There is nothing more to it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She recalled the colonel had not been reading, his eyes had been fixed and brooding. Furthermore, the train had been entirely dark. How could he be so certain Finch had simply expired during that specific window of time, unless he had been paying far closer attention to the man than he claimed? "Very well," Slack muttered, scribbling quickly. "Mr. Crabtree, you were seated adjacent to the deceased." Mr. Crabtree stepped forward, his posture rigidly defensive. "I was immersed in complex financial projections. I barely registered Mr. Finch's presence. During the electrical failure, I remained perfectly still to avoid disorganizing my paperwork. I heard a rustle, a slight thump, and assumed luggage had shifted. I have vital meetings tomorrow, Inspector. This delay is costing my firm a considerable sum." A thump, Slack repeated, his tone skeptical. "Luggage does not typically shift on a decelerating train without a significant jolt." "Mr. Crabtree, was there a jolt?" "I am an accountant, Inspector." "Not a railway engineer," Crabtree replied frostily. Letitia Price let out a small, involuntary gasp, clutching her brown envelope tighter against her chest. Inspector Slack immediately pivoted toward her, his gaze narrowing. "Miss Price, is it? You appear distressed. Did you see or hear something during the blackout?" "I heard the scratching," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "as I told the others outside. A sharp, metallic scrape, and someone brushed past my knees in the aisle." Reverend Thomas leaned forward, his face pale with concern. "She was quite terrified, Inspector. The darkness was absolute. Anyone could have moved about." Slack scoffed loudly, slapping his pen onto the desk. "Moved about to do what, Reverend? Induce a heart attack in the dark? Utter nonsense. The surgeon will confirm it was natural causes, and you will all be on your way. You are letting the shock of a sudden death muddy your common sense." In her corner, Miss Marple smiled benignly at her knitting. She knew Inspector Slack was entirely wrong. A heart attack did not cleanly sever a silver-plated button from a coat, nor did it unscrew a hip flask. She quietly slipped her hand into her reticule, feeling the cold, hard edge of the button she had found on the platform. Before anyone could be dismissed, the heavy wooden door swung open. A pale young constable stepped inside, leaning down to whisper urgently into Inspector Slack's ear. The pen clattered to the floor. His annoyance vanished, replaced by rigid professionalism. He stood, his gaze sweeping the passengers with sudden suspicion. "It appears," Inspector Slack said, his voice dropping, "nobody will be going anywhere tonight. Mr. Finch was poisoned." The word "poisoned" hung in the dusty air of the station master's office like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Inspector Slack's demeanor transformed instantly from bureaucratic irritation to predatory focus. He paced the small room, his eyes darting between the pale faces of the detained passengers. The sudden death of a loud, unpopular man by a heart attack was a nuisance. Murder, however, was a career opportunity. Miss Marple continued her knitting, the rhythmic click of her needles, the only sound breaking the stunned silence. She watched Inspector Slack puff out his chest, recognizing the precise moment he decided to construct a narrative rather than uncover the truth. He needed a swift resolution, an obvious villain to present to the chief constable by morning. His gaze landed heavily on Letitia Price. She was still shivering, her knuckles stark white against the thick brown envelope resting on her lap. To a man like Inspector Slack, fear was indistinguishable from guilt. He stepped toward her, his shadow falling across her trembling shoulders. He demanded to know exactly what business a legal secretary had traveled on the last train with documents she guarded so fiercely. Letitia stammered, her voice barely a whisper, explaining that she worked for the firm handling the zoning disputes for Mr. Finch's new development project. The envelope, she confessed, contained a finalized injunction meant to halt the construction entirely, an injunction Mr. Finch had been furious about when he learned of its drafting earlier that afternoon in London. Slack smiled, a tight, triumphant expression. He pointed out the staggering coincidence. A woman carrying documents that would ruin a wealthy man's empire happens to be seated merely inches from him when the lights fail. In that convenient darkness, a lethal substance is administered. It was, the inspector declared, the oldest motive in the world, financial ruin prevented by a desperate act. Reverend Harmon leapt to his feet, his usual mildness replaced by a sudden, fierce indignation. He argued that it was preposterous, that Miss Price was a gentlewoman of impeccable character who barely knew the deceased. He insisted that she had been terrified by the darkness, not using it as a cloak for murder. Inspector Slack dismissed the clergyman with a wave of his hand, noting loudly that the Reverend's protective instincts seemed rather overly developed for a mere train acquaintance. He then formally requested that Miss Price hand over the envelope and the contents of her handbag. From her quiet corner, Miss Marple observed this theatrical display with mild dismay. It was entirely like Inspector Slack to grab the first brightly coloured thread he saw and pull, ignoring the complex knot beneath. Letitia Price was terrified, yes, but her fear was the frantic, trapped terror of a bird in a snare, not the calculated coldness of a poisoner. Furthermore, the mechanics of the crime bothered Miss Marple deeply. To administer poison in pitch darkness required not just proximity, but immense precision and steady nerves. Letitia's hands had been shaking since the train left Paddington. She lacked the necessary composure. Then there was the severed silver button resting in Miss Marple's reticule. It did not belong to Letitia's modest woolen coat, nor to the Reverend's sombre clerical garb. It belonged to a man's tailored garment. While Inspector Slack loudly interrogated the weeping secretary, Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes drifted toward the two men who had remained notably silent during this exchange. Colonel Bantry was staring fixedly at the wall, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Mr. Crabtree was meticulously realigning his fountain pen with the edge of his clipboard, his face an unreadable mask of absolute neutrality. The obvious suspect had been cornered, just as the inspector desired, but Miss Marple knew that true wickedness rarely announced itself so loudly. It preferred to sit quietly in the corner, blending in perfectly, waiting for someone else to take the blame. The poison had been administered with cunning, and cunning was a trait severely lacking in the weeping girl. Inspector Slack's voice rattled the station master's tin teacups. He was thoroughly convinced of Letitia Price's guilt, weaving a rapid narrative of corporate sabotage and desperate murder. The poor girl had stopped trembling and was now perfectly rigid, staring at the floorboards. Reverend Harmon stood firmly at her side, his hands clenched into fists, though his protests were repeatedly drowned out by the inspector's bluster. Jane Marple recognized that arguing with Inspector Slack in full pursuit was akin to arguing with a runaway horse. It was far more productive to examine the tracks he was ignoring. She let her ball of pink wool drop, allowing it to roll slowly toward the door. With a soft exclamation of dismay, she stood, apologizing mildly to the room at large. She intercepted Constable Palk near the doorway, touching his sleeve with a feather-light hand. She whispered that she had dropped a sentimental pearl-headed hatpin in the train carriage during the confusion. She asked if he might kindly escort an old woman back to her seat for just a moment, before the railway men moved the carriage into the sidings. Constable Palk, eager to escape the stifling heat, readily agreed. He led her out into the biting night air, their footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel platform. The first-class carriage was eerily quiet now. The police surgeon had already removed Alistair Finch's body, leaving only an empty corner seat. Constable Palk hovered in the doorway, his flashlight sweeping over the upholstery, while Miss Marple moved straight to her former seat. She made a show of patting the cushions, but her sharp blue eyes were entirely focused on the space where the deceased had sat. She leaned closer to the leather armrest. In the confined space, the faint residual scents of the journey were distinct. She could smell the stale tang of the railway, the lingering damp of wool, and something else entirely, a sharp, astringent odour, barely discernible, clinging to the fabric where Finch's coat had rested. It was distinctly botanical and extremely rare. Then she saw it. On the small wooden window ledge directly adjacent to where Finch's head had rested, there was a fresh gleaming scratch in the varnished wood. It was deep and jagged, and resting directly beneath this scratch, caught in the crevice between the wood and the leather seat, was a tiny, undisturbed dusting of pale grey ash. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely stared, her mind cataloguing the facts. Alistair Finch had not been smoking. His scent was of claret and old cologne. The only man in the carriage radiating the heavy, distinct aroma of good cigars was Colonel Arthur Bantry. Furthermore, to deposit ash in that specific crevice and to scratch the wood so deeply, someone would have had to lean directly across Finch's body, pressing hard against the window frame. This aligned perfectly with the severed silver button hidden in her reticule. It was an awkward, forceful maneuver, executed in absolute darkness. It required a shocking proximity to the victim. "I cannot seem to find it, Constable," Miss Marple said softly, straightening her posture. "Perhaps it rolled beneath the heating grates. We should return before the inspector notices our absence." As they walked back along the frost-covered platform, Jane Marple's mind was a flurry of calculated connections. Inspector Slack was focused on the frightened girl, convinced she had slipped poison into Finch's silver hip flask. But Miss Marple knew the truth was far more physical. The killer had leaned over a sleeping man in pitch black, their coat catching, their cigar ash falling, and administered the fatal dose directly. The question was why a man like the Colonel, or the meticulous Mr. Crabtree, would risk such a brutal assassination. Returning to the office, the clear night was yielding to a thick, icy fog rolling off the meadows, pressing against the grimy windows of the station master's office. Inside, the atmosphere was equally suffocating. Inspector Slack was still relentlessly pursuing Letitia Price, whose tears had dried into a mask of exhausted terror. Miss Marple settled back into her hard wooden chair, her knitting retrieved. She cleared her throat, a sound as gentle as a pigeon's coo, yet it somehow sliced through the inspector's booming voice. She wondered aloud, entirely to her pink wool, if a frightened young woman in the dark could possess the sheer physical strength required to lean across a heavy man, snag a button, and leave a deep gouge in the window frame without being noticed. Slack paused, his face reddening. He demanded to know what nonsense the old woman was prattling about. Miss Marple merely blinked, pointing out that Alistair Finch was a very large man, and the aisle was quite narrow. It would take a gentleman of substantial build to lean over him forcefully enough to administer poison directly, perhaps while pretending to brace himself against the carriage wall during the blackout. The remark landed exactly where she intended. Mr. Crabtree's pen snapped in his rigid grip, the sharp crack echoing in the small room. Ink stained his immaculate fingers, but the accountant did not seem to notice. His pristine veneer had cracked. Miss Marple observed the sudden frantic pulse beating at his temple. Under Slack's suddenly redirected and highly suspicious glare, Crabtree's precise composure unraveled. He confessed, his voice tight and high, that Finch Development Project was not merely built on shaky ground, it was a colossal fraud. Finch had been blackmailing Crabtree, threatening to expose a minor. Decades-old discrepancy in the accountant's early career unless Crabtree signed off on the fictitious financial projections. If Finch lived to present those documents to the investors the following morning, Crabtree would face absolute professional ruin and likely imprisonment. Before the inspector could formally charge the trembling accountant, Colonel Bantry let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The robust man seemed to deflate, his aggressive posture collapsing into the tweed of his coat. He admitted, staring at the floorboards, that financial ruin was a poor motive compared to a father's despair. His son, the boy he had argued with in London, owed Finch a staggering gambling debt. Finch had promised to call in the debt by the end of the week, a move that would bankrupt the Bantry estate and publicly disgrace the family name forever. Reverend Thomas, standing protectively near Letitia, looked horrified by the sudden eruption of ugly truths. He stated quietly that he had seen the colonel stand up just as the train plunged into darkness. Bantry immediately roared a denial, claiming he had only shifted his weight, but the seed of doubt had taken firm root in the room. Miss Marple kept her eyes perfectly lowered. The quiet carriage had been a powder keg, packed tightly with desperate men harboring deeply personal motives for murder, a ruined reputation, a blackmailed accountant, a desperate father facing the destruction of his legacy. The dark had simply provided the spark. Yet, despite these dramatic confessions, a nagging inconsistency remained in the old spinster's mind. If the colonel had lunged or if Crabtree had struck in a panic, why was the method so exquisitely precise? Poison required calculation, not a frenzied outburst in the pitch black. The severed silver button in her reticule and the ash on the window ledge told a story of brutal, forceful proximity, but the poison spoke of cold, detached premeditation. As the thick fog outside fully obscured the platform, plunging the station into an eerie, isolated grey haze, Miss Marple realized that one of these desperate confessions was a carefully constructed lie designed to mask an even darker truth. The thick, yellowish fog now pressed so tightly against the station master's windows that the world beyond the glass seemed to have vanished entirely. Inside the cramped office, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and the metallic tang of fear. Inspector Slack was practically preening, convinced that he had broken both Colonel Bantry and Mr. Crabtree. He paced the small floor space, his boots rhythmic and loud, as he debated which man to handcuff first. The confessions of blackmail and gambling debts were, to Slack's mind, the definitive end of the case. Miss Marple, however, remained remarkably still, her knitting needles silent for the first time. She was staring at the brown envelope that Letitia Price still held with white-knuckled intensity. The girl had not joined in the sudden eruption of accusations. She had instead retreated into a stony, haunted silence that felt far more profound than the colonel's blustering rage or Crabtree's cold calculations. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through Slack's triumphant muttering. "I find it most peculiar that Mr. Finch's silver hip flask was found on the floor of the carriage, yet there was no spill on the upholstery. If a man is poisoned while drinking in the dark, one would expect a certain amount of, well, messiness. Wouldn't you agree?" Slack stopped mid-stride, his face darkening with irritation. He told her to leave the forensics to the professionals and to stop meddling in a closed matter. But the seed of a new doubt had been planted. Before he could resume his interrogation, the station door creaked open, admitting a gust of freezing fog and a very damp Constable Pauck. He was carrying a small, mud-streaked leather valise that had been recovered from the tracks a few hundred yards back from the station. "Found this near the signal box, sir," Pauck panted, placing the bag on the desk. "It appears to have been thrown from the train just before we reached the platform." Inspector Slack snapped the latches open. Inside were not gold bars or secret documents, but a collection of mundane items: a shaving kit, a spare shirt, and a small velvet-lined box containing a heavy gold pocket watch. But it was the bottom of the bag that drew a sharp collective intake of breath. Tucked away in a side pocket was a small, amber glass vial, its label carefully scraped away, but its glass stopper still smelling faintly of the same bitter, botanical almond scent Miss Marple had detected in the carriage. Beside the vial lay a single, crumpled telegram addressed to Alistair Finch. It was no threat from a blackmailed accountant or a desperate father. It was a message from a private inquiry agent in London, confirming that the identity of the long-lost niece has been verified. The room went deathly quiet. Every eye turned toward Letitia Price. The girl didn't flinch, she didn't weep. Instead, a slow, chillingly calm expression settled over her features. The restless, vibrating tension she had exhibited on the train was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged composure that made her look 10 years older. Miss Marple sighed, a sound of genuine sorrow. She realized now that the scratching Letitia had described was not a mouse or a pin. It was the sound of the glass stopper being forced into the vial after the deed was done. The draft she felt wasn't someone passing her, it was her own movement as she lunged across the sleeping man to ensure the poison reached its mark. The silver button in Miss Marple's pocket did not belong to the colonel or the accountant. It was a decorative button from a woman's high-fashion London coat, the kind of coat a long-lost niece might wear to impress a wealthy, long-absent uncle before she silenced him forever to secure her inheritance. The narrative of the frightened secretary was crumbling, revealing a far more calculated deception. The presence of the vial in a bag thrown from the train suggested an accomplice, or perhaps a desperate attempt to rid herself of the evidence before the police arrived. But as Miss Marple looked at the Reverend Harmon, who was staring at Letitia with a mixture of adoration and dawning horror, she realized the twist was deeper still. The Reverend was not just a protector, he was the one who had provided the draft of alibi. The small office felt as though the walls were physically closing in as the heavy yellow fog pressed against the glass. Inspector Slack was momentarily paralyzed, his hand hovering over the mud-streaked valise, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the weeping secretary with the cold evidence of the amber vial. Letitia Price remained unnervingly still, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere above the inspector's shoulder. The silence was fragile, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Miss Marple chose that moment to resume her knitting. The rhythmic, domestic click of her needles was the only sound in the room, a sharp contrast to the high-stakes tension of a murder investigation. She didn't look at the inspector, nor at the bag. Instead, she looked directly at Reverend Harmon, who was standing by the radiator, his face ashen and his breath coming in short, ragged hitches. "It is a very sad business, is it not, Vicar?" Miss Marple said, her voice mild and conversational, as if they were discussing the disappointing turnout at a parish bake sale. "To find that someone we admire has been carrying such a heavy burden of secrets. It reminds me so much of young Tommy Bond in our village. A lovely boy, always helping the elderly, yet he simply couldn't resist the temptation of the collection box once he felt his uncle had treated him unfairly." The Reverend flinched at the word uncle. He looked at Miss Marple, his eyes wide and watery behind his spectacles. "I
I don't follow your meaning, Miss Marple. We are talking about a brutal crime, not a village boy's lapse in judgment.
Oh, but human nature is remarkably consistent, whether in St. Mary Mead or on a first-class carriage to Paddington, she replied, her needles never faltering. You see, the difficulty with secrets is that they require such constant maintenance. One must remember exactly what was said in the dark, and exactly what was heard. Miss Price mentioned a scratching sound and a draught. Such specific details for someone who claimed to be paralyzed by fear, wouldn't you say? It's almost as if she were reciting a lesson. Inspector Slack turned his head sharply toward Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? Speak plainly for once. I am merely thinking about the button, she said, reaching into her reticule and producing the silver-plated object. She held it up to the light, letting it glint. I found this on the platform. It didn't come from a gentleman's coat. It is far too delicate. It came from a very expensive, very modern lady's travelling cloak, the kind one might buy in a London boutique to look the part of a wealthy heiress. But what is truly fascinating, Inspector, is that it wasn't torn off in a struggle. The thread was cut, cleanly, with a very sharp pair of embroidery scissors. She turned her gaze back to the Reverend. You have such a kind heart, Vicar. It must have been devastating when Miss Price confessed to you during that long dinner in London before you boarded the train that her uncle Alistair intended to disinherit her the moment they reached the village. He had found out, you see, that she wasn't the daughter of his sister at all, but a clever girl from the typing pool who had forged the letters. She needed someone to vouch for her, someone whose character was above reproach, someone who would say they felt a draught or heard a scratching to explain away her movements in the dark. The Reverend's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Letitia, seeking a denial, but she didn't even turn her head. She looked at him with a detached, almost bored contempt. You see, Vicar, Miss Marple continued, her voice dropping to a tone of profound pity. A man like Alistair Finch doesn't just die. He is removed when he becomes an obstacle. And a girl who can forge a family history can certainly forge a romance with a lonely country clergyman. She knew you would be her shield. She knew that if the lights went out, and she leaned over to drop the poison into his open mouth, while he snored a very precise task, as I note to you would be the one to swear she never moved from her seat. You were her alibi, carefully groomed and perfectly placed. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her knitting tucked under her arm. She walked toward the Reverend, stopping just inches from him. Tell me, Vicar, did she tell you it was a medicine? Did she tell you she was only trying to make him sleep so she could recover the documents from his pocket? Is that why you helped her throw the valise into the fog? Because you couldn't believe the girl you loved was a murderer? The Reverend Harmon broke. He sank onto a wooden stool, burying his face in his hands, his sobs racking his thin frame. She said he was a monster. She said he would ruin us both. I didn't know it was poison. I thought we were just stopping him from being cruel. In the corner, Letitia Price finally spoke. Her voice was flat, devoid of the trembling sweetness she had used all evening. Shut up, you fool. You've ruined everything. Inspector Slack didn't wait for another word. He stepped forward, the heavy click of handcuffs finally signaling the end of his uncertainty. But as he led the girl away, Miss Marple didn't look triumphant. She looked at the sobbing man on the stool and sighed. Human nature, she thought, was so very often a matter of believing exactly what we want to believe, until the light finally returns and shows us the truth. Inspector Slack stood by the desk, the pair of handcuffs glinting under the harsh electric light as they snapped around Letitia Price's slender wrists. The girl did not struggle, she merely watched the inspector with a cold, detached curiosity that was far more chilling than any outburst of grief. In the corner, the Reverend Harmon continued to sob into his hands, his world having collapsed into a heap of betrayal and misplaced devotion. The Colonel and Mr. Crabtree remained frozen, their own secrets still hanging in the air, though they now seemed like petty misdemeanors compared to the calculated malice of the woman standing before them. Miss Marple smoothed the front of her tweed skirt and sat back down, her expression one of quiet, sorrowful reflection. She looked at the amber vial on the desk and then at the silver button she had placed there moments before. It was time, she knew, to thread the final needle of this tapestry. You see, Inspector, Miss Marple began, her voice steady and gentle, the difficulty with a crime committed in the dark. is that the murderer must rely entirely on touch and timing. Most people assume the darkness is a shield, but for the observant, it is a map. When the lights flickered and died, we all reacted according to our natures. The Colonel bristled, Mr. Crabtree froze, and the poor vicar prayed. But Letitia, whatever her real name may be, acted with the precision of a surgeon. She knew exactly where Mr. Finch's head was resting. She knew he had a habit of sleeping with his mouth slightly agape after a heavy dinner. It wasn't the hip flask she targeted, Inspector. That was a clever distraction, a red herring, as they say. She dropped the poison directly into his mouth. Slack frowned, leaning over the desk. Directly. In the pitch black? That's an incredible risk, Miss Marple. One slip and he wakes up, or she misses entirely. Not if she had a guide, Miss Marple replied, pointing to the deep scratch she had found on the window ledge. That scratch wasn't an accident. She had placed a small, sharp pin in the wood earlier in the journey, marking the exact height of his shoulder. In the dark, she didn't need to see him, she only needed to feel for that pin. She leaned across, her coat catching on the seat, which is how the button was severed, and used the pin to guide her hand. It was a remarkably efficient business. I believe you'll find the matching pin still stuck in the woodwork of the carriage if you look closely enough. Letitia's lip curled into a sneer. You're a very clever old woman, aren't you? Sitting there with your knitting like a common gossip while you plot to ruin me. I didn't plot to ruin you, my dear, Miss Marple said sadly. You ruined yourself the moment you decided that another person's life was worth less than a bank balance. You were quite right about one thing, though. The scratching sound you described was real. It was the sound of you frantically trying to remove that guiding pin from the wood after the deed was done. But you were interrupted when the lights came back on too soon, and you had to snap the pin off rather than pull it out. That is why the scratch is so deep and the metal remains embedded. The inspector picked up the amber vial. And the poison? Digital in, I presume? It would look like a heart attack to a rush doctor. Precisely, Miss Marple nodded. A concentrated dose. It acts quickly on a heart already weakened by the Colonel's description of excessive living. She had researched her victim well. She knew his weaknesses, both physical and moral. She played on the vicar's loneliness to ensure she wouldn't be searched, and she played on the village gossip to ensure the Colonel or Mr. Crabtree would be the primary suspects. It was a very well-staged play, but like all amateur theatricals, the costumes were a bit too deliberate. That button was much too expensive for a simple secretary, and the telegram in the valise proved that the real Alistair Finch was finally catching on to the charade. The station door opened, and the police surgeon entered, looking tired and grim. He nodded to Slack, confirming that the initial toxicology indicated an alkaloid poison. The finality of the statement seemed to suck the last bit of air from the room. Miss Marple stood up and began to pack her knitting into her bag. The pink baby booty was nearly finished now. She looked at the group one last time, the broken clergyman, the shamed accountant, the weary colonel, and the cold young woman. It was a scene she had witnessed many times in many different forms. The setting changed, the names changed, but the underlying darkness of the human heart remained constant. I think Miss Marple said softly to the room at large that I should like to go home now. My garden will be needing attention in the morning, and I find that flowers are much more predictable than people. As the constable led Letitia Price out into the waiting police car, the girl stopped at the door and looked back at the small, unassuming old lady. For a second, the mask of contempt slipped, replaced by a flicker of genuine wonder at how she had been undone by a pair of knitting needles and a silver button. Then she vanished into the fog. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a fog so thick it seemed to swallow the very hedges and stone walls of the village. It was a silent, spectral world, yet the news of the last train murder had already begun to permeate the mist like a slow-moving ink stain. By the time the milkman had finished his rounds, the identity of the victim and the arrest of the mysterious Miss Price were the only topics of conversation at every breakfast table. The peaceful facade of the village remained, but beneath it, the gears of gossip were grinding with renewed, feverish energy. Jane Marple sat in her small, sun-drenched morning room, though the sun was currently an ash-grey smudge behind the heavy vapours. She was dressed in her usual lavender wool, her gardening trunk resting by her feet. Before her sat a delicate china cup of Lapsang Souchong tea, the steam rising in a thin, steady coil. She looked entirely at peace, the sharp, clinical intensity she had displayed in the station master's office, replaced by the gentle vagueness of a Victorian spinster. There was a brisk knock at the door. Cherry, her energetic young helper, burst in with the morning paper. Her eyes were wide with excitement. She breathlessly recounted the headlines, detailing how the Black Widow of the rails had been apprehended by the brilliant Inspector Slack. Cherry leaned in, whispering that the village was saying the Colonel had nearly been hanged for it, and that poor Mr. Crabtree was currently in London trying to salvage his reputation from the wreckage of Alistair Finch's fraudulent schemes. Miss Marple listened with a polite, slightly distant smile. She knew that the brilliant Inspector Slack would take every ounce of credit in his official report, and she was perfectly content with that arrangement. Recognition was a loud, heavy burden she had no desire to carry. She much preferred the invisibility that allowed her to observe the world without the world observing her back. She noted, with a small sigh of pity, that Reverend Harmon had been on vacation. The poor man's faith in human goodness had been shattered, a wound that often took far longer to heal than any physical injury. "It is a very strange thing, Cherry," Miss Marple said, carefully setting her teacup back into its saucer with a precise click. "How often people mistake a quiet exterior for a quiet mind. That young woman Letitia, or whatever her name truly is, thought that because we were all tired and elderly and caught in the dark, we were also blind. She didn't realize that when the eyes cannot see, the mind begins to see much more clearly. She was like a character in one of those modern plays where everyone shouts and no one listens. She forgot that the smallest detail, silver button, dusting of ash, guiding pin, often the loudest voices in the room." Cherry nodded vigorously, though it was clear she didn't quite follow the elderly lady's philosophical drift. She asked if Miss Marple wanted her to start on the silver polishing, but Miss Marple shook her head. She had other plans for the morning. She picked up her trug and her sturdy pruning shears, heading out into the dampened garden. The air was cold, and the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves was pungent. She moved toward her rose bushes, which were looking a bit bedraggled after the night's frost. As she worked, her mind drifted back to Alistair Finch's face. She remembered him as a boy, a bully who enjoyed the power of a secret. It was a tragic symmetry, she mused, that he had been undone by a secret he didn't even know he was keeping, the secret of his own impending disinheritance, of a girl who wasn't his niece. She snipped a dead branch with a sharp, decisive snap. Evil, she reflected, was rarely a grand, operatic event. It was usually something small and tawdry, born of greed, vanity, or a simple refusal to be inconvenienced. It was as common as a weed in a well-kept garden. You could pull it out, you could clear the soil, but you had to remain eternally vigilant, for the seeds were always there, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. The fog began to lift slightly, revealing the spire of the village church in the distance. St. Mary Mead was returning to its routine. The shops would open, the vicar would be replaced by a temporary curate, and the Colonel would eventually return to his club to grumble about the railway service. The tragedy on the 11:15 from Paddington would become a local legend, told and retold until the facts were as blurred as the faces in the mist. Miss Marple stood tall, stretching her back and looking out over her domain. She felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not for the capture of a criminal, but for the restoration of order. The balance had been tipped, and she had helped to right it. She tucked a stray lock of white hair beneath her hat and moved on to the next bush. There was always more pruning to be done, always more weeds to find, and always, she knew with a quiet certainty, another train pulling into another station where human nature would eventually reveal its darker side.